I still remember the moment when my son handed me that shiny black suitcase and the crisp first-class ticket to Europe. It should have been the happiest day of my life, but instead, it turned into a nightmare I never saw coming. When I reached the bustling JFK airport, already tired from weeks of waiting, a police dog suddenly lunged at my suitcase, tearing through the fabric as if it had a vendetta. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and at 73 years old, I thought I knew what love looked like. I thought I understood the weight of sacrifice, the quiet dignity of giving everything for your children. But that morning in my cramped Queens apartment, surrounded by the familiar scent of instant coffee and the distant hum of traffic on Northern Boulevard, I discovered that sometimes the people we love the most can become the architects of our deepest pain. The suitcase sat there on my kitchen table like a black promise. Michael, my son, had placed it there with such ceremony, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke about this wonderful trip he was giving me. "Mom, you deserve this," he had said, his eyes not quite meeting mine. "First class to Paris, then Rome. Everything's paid for. All you have to do is pack and enjoy yourself." I should have felt joy. I should have felt gratitude. Instead, there was something cold settling in my chest, something that whispered warnings I wasn't ready to hear. The apartment felt smaller that morning, the walls pressing in with their collection of memories. Photos of Michael's graduation, his wedding, the grandchildren I rarely saw anymore. Each frame held a piece of my heart that had been given freely, desperately, without question. The suitcase was expensive, that much I could tell. Black leather with silver clasps, the kind of luggage I'd only seen in airport shops when I was picking up Michael after his business trips, back when he still needed me to drive him places. Back when he still called me Mom with warmth instead of obligation. I ran my fingers along the smooth surface, and that's when I felt it. A small tear in the lining, barely noticeable unless you were really looking. Inside, tucked between the fabric layers, was a folded piece of paper. My hands shook as I pulled it out, unfolded it, read the words written in Michael's familiar handwriting. "Don't say a word, you owe me." The paper fluttered to the floor like a dying bird. I stared at it, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. What did I owe him? What wasn't I supposed to say? And why would he hide this message where I might never find it? The questions multiplied like shadows as the sun moved across my small kitchen. I picked up the note, read it again, hoping I'd misunderstood. But the words remained the same, cold and threatening in their simplicity. This wasn't a gift. This was something else entirely. I thought about calling Michael, demanding an explanation, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the memory of all the other times I'd questioned him, only to be made to feel like I was imagining things, being paranoid, being the difficult mother who couldn't just accept kindness when it was offered. The weeks leading up to the trip blurred together in a haze of preparation and growing unease. I bought new clothes with money I could barely afford, money that should have gone toward my medications. I canceled appointments, arranged for Mrs. Chen next door to water my plants, even though she barely spoke English, and I wasn't sure she understood what I was asking. Michael called once during those weeks, his voice distant and businesslike. "Everything ready, Mom? You packed? The car will pick you up at 6 in the morning." No small talk, no excitement about my upcoming adventure. Just logistics, as if I were a package being shipped somewhere. The morning of departure arrived gray and cold. Typical October weather in Queens. I stood at my window, watching the black sedan idle on the street below, exhaust fumes creating small clouds in the chilly air. The driver honked once, impatient. I grabbed the mysterious suitcase, my purse, and the envelope containing my passport and ticket. In the elevator, I caught my reflection in the polished metal doors. I looked older than 73, I realized. The woman staring back at me had deep lines around her eyes, gray hair that had lost its curl, clothes that hung loose on a frame that had been shrinking for years. When had I become so small? When had I started disappearing? The ride to JFK was silent except for the radio playing soft jazz and the occasional crackle of the driver's phone. I clutched the suitcase handle, my knuckles white with tension I couldn't explain. The note was still there, folded in my coat pocket like a tiny bomb waiting to explode. The airport was chaos, as always. Hundreds of travelers rushing in every direction, dragging their own burdens behind them. I found the check-in counter for my airline, joined the first-class line as Michael had instructed. The agent was young and pretty, probably the same age as my granddaughter Emma, if Emma still spoke to me. "Destination?" the agent asked, fingers poised over her keyboard. "Paris," I said, the word feeling foreign in my mouth. I'd never been to Europe. Harold, my late husband, had always talked about taking me someday, but someday never came before the cancer took him. The agent looked at my passport, then at her screen, frowning slightly. Mrs. Patterson, there seems to be a note on your reservation. You'll need to go through additional security screening. Additional security screening. The words hit me like ice water. Why? Is there a problem? It's just routine, she said, but her smile had become professional, distant. Please take your luggage to gate 7. There's a security checkpoint there. I walked through the airport in a daze, the suitcase wheels clicking against the polished floor like a countdown. Gate 7 wasn't near the departure gates. It was in a separate area, sterile and cold, with institutional lighting that made everything look sickly yellow. A TSA agent directed me to a metal table. Please place your luggage here, ma'am. He was polite but firm, and I noticed how he kept glancing at someone behind me, as if waiting for a signal. That's when I saw him. A handler with a German shepherd, the dog's ears alert, nose twitching. The animal moved with purpose, straining slightly against its lead as it approached my suitcase. Is this necessary? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The agent didn't answer. The dog circled the table once, twice, then suddenly lunged forward, its teeth sinking into the black leather with a sound that made several people turn and stare. The suitcase tore open like a mouth screaming, and immediately the dog's handler pulled him back, shouting commands. Everything happened so fast after that. More agents appeared surrounding the table, their voices a blur of radio static and official jargon. Someone was asking me questions, but the words seemed to come from underwater. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold my ID when they asked for it again. They found it quickly. Hidden in the false bottom of the suitcase, wrapped in plastic. Packages of white powder that I'd never seen before in my life. My knees gave out, and someone caught me, guided me to a chair that felt 1,000 miles away from my body. Ma'am, we need you to remain calm, an agent was saying. Do you know what this is? I stared at the packages, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. I don't know. I've never seen that before. My son gave me this suitcase. He said it was a gift. The questions came in waves after that. When did I last see my son? Who packed the suitcase? Did anyone else have access to it? I answered as best I could, but my voice sounded strange to my own ears, hollow and distant. They kept me in that small windowless room for what felt like hours. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the air tasted of recycling and fear. Through the thin walls, I could hear the normal sounds of the airport continuing without me. People catching flights, embracing loved ones, living their lives while mine crumbled in real time. Eventually, a detective arrived. He was kind, patient, explaining that they believed I was being used as an unwitting courier. The drugs were worth millions on the European market, he said. Someone had planned this carefully, using an elderly woman as a cover because she was less likely to be suspected. Mrs. Patterson, we don't believe you knew about this, he said gently, but we need you to help us understand how this suitcase came into your possession. I told him everything, about Michael, about the note I'd found, about the strange distance in my son's behavior leading up to the trip. The detective listened, taking notes, his expression growing more serious with each detail. Where is this note now? He asked. I reached into my coat pocket with trembling fingers, pulled out the small piece of paper. The detective read it, then looked at me with something that might have been pity. Mrs. Patterson, I think your son was counting on you not finding this. This appears to be insurance in case you were caught. Something to keep you quiet. The words hit me like physical blows. My own son had used me as a drug mule, had planned for me to be arrested in a foreign country, had prepared to abandon me there with a cryptic note as my only lifeline. The son I'd raised, supported through college, forgiven for every disappointment and betrayal. They released me that evening after confirming my story, after hours of questions and paperwork and the gradual, devastating realization that I was a victim, not a criminal. But as I sat in the taxi taking me back to Queens, watching the familiar streets blur past in the darkness, I felt like I was seeing everything for the first time. The apartment felt different when I walked in. Smaller, shabbier, but also somehow safer. I made myself a cup of tea with hands that still shook, sat at my kitchen table where the whole nightmare had begun, and tried to understand what had just happened to my life. The phone rang around midnight. Michael's number on the caller ID. I stared at it for 6 long rings before it went to voicemail. Then it rang again, and again. I didn't answer. Instead, I listened to the messages he left, each one more frantic than the last. Mom, what happened? The airline called, said you missed your flight. Are you okay? Mom, seriously, call me back. I'm worried. Eleanor, pick up the damn phone. I need to know what's going on. By the 4th message, the worry had transformed into something sharper, more urgent. Mom, whatever happened, Whatever anyone told you, just remember what we talked about. Remember what I said about family loyalty. Family loyalty. The phrase that had governed my entire life. The invisible chain that had bound me to silence and sacrifice for decades. I deleted the messages without listening to the rest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the signs I'd missed. All the moments when I'd sensed something was wrong but had talked myself out of my own instincts. The way Michael had insisted on packing the suitcase himself. The way he'd been so specific about my travel route, about which security lines to use. The way he'd avoided my eyes when he'd given me the gift. But it wasn't just about the drugs or the suitcase. As I lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of my neighborhood settling into sleep, I realized this was just the latest in a long line of betrayals that I'd been ignoring, explaining away, forgiving because I was so desperate to maintain the illusion that I still had a family who loved me. For 30 years since Harold died, I'd poured everything into Michael and his family. I'd given them money I couldn't spare, time I'd never get back, forgiveness they'd never earned. I'd enabled their selfishness by making excuses for their behavior, by being so grateful for any scrap of attention that I'd never demanded the basic respect I deserved. I thought about Emma, my granddaughter, who used to call me every week until she went to college. Then the calls became monthly, then sporadic, then stopped altogether. When I'd asked Michael about it, he'd shrugged. "She's busy, Mom. Kids her age have their own lives." But I'd seen Emma posting on social media, had watched her celebrating holidays with her other grandmother, the one who traveled and bought expensive gifts and never asked for anything in return. I'd told myself it didn't matter, that love wasn't supposed to be a competition. But it hurt. It hurt more than I'd ever admitted to anyone, including myself. I thought about Sarah, my daughter-in-law, who smiled sweetly to my face, but always had an excuse for why I couldn't see the grandchildren. Birthday parties I wasn't invited to, family dinners I wasn't told about, photos of gatherings I'd only see later on Facebook, wondering why I'd been excluded from my own family's life. I thought about Michael himself, the little boy I'd raised alone after Harold died, working 2 jobs to keep us afloat, sacrificing my own dreams so he could have every opportunity. The boy who'd promised to take care of me when I got old, who'd sworn he'd never let me be alone. When had that sweet child become this stranger who could look me in the eye and plan my destruction? The questions haunted me through the long hours before dawn. By the time the sun rose over Queens, painting my small kitchen in pale gold light, I had made a decision that would have been unthinkable just 24 hours earlier. I was going to confront my son, but more than that, I was going to stop pretending that our relationship was something it wasn't. I was going to stop accepting crumbs and calling them a feast. I was going to demand the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The phone rang again as I was making coffee. Michael's number, as expected. This time, I answered. "Mom, thank God. What happened yesterday?" "The airline said you never boarded the plane." His voice sounded normal, concerned, loving even. For a moment, I almost let myself believe that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, that he really had no idea what had been hidden in that suitcase. "Michael," I said quietly, "we need to talk." "Of course, Mom. Are you feeling okay? Did you get sick? We can reschedule the trip." I found the note. The silence that followed lasted an eternity. I could hear him breathing, could almost see him calculating, deciding how to play this. "What note?" he finally said, but his voice had changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by something careful and cold. "The one you hid in the suitcase lining, the one that said I owed you and not to say a word." Another pause. Then, "Mom, I think you're confused. Maybe you should see a doctor. Sometimes at your age, don't you dare." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't soften them. "Don't you dare make me think I'm losing my mind when you know exactly what I'm talking about. Look, whatever you think you found, it was drugs, Michael. The suitcase was full of drugs. The police found them. A dog tore the case open right there in the airport, and they arrested me. Me, your 73-year-old mother, because you used me as a drug mule." The silence this time was different. Heavier, guilty. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said finally, but his voice was hollow now, unconvincing even to himself. "Yes, you do. You planned this. You were going to let me get arrested in Europe, maybe even go to prison, and that note was supposed to keep me quiet about it. What were you going to do if I'd been convicted? Just leave me there? Mom, you're being paranoid. Stop lying to me." I surprised myself with the volume of my voice, with the anger that came pouring out after decades of being pushed down. "I'm done with your lies, Michael. I'm done pretending that you're the son I raised instead of the stranger who tried to destroy my life." He hung up. I stood there holding the phone, listening to the dial tone, and realized I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: relief. The truth was finally out in the open, ugly and devastating, but out in the open. No more pretending, no more making excuses, no more lying to myself about what my relationship with my son had become, but the relief was short-lived. Over the next few days, Michael launched what I can only describe as a campaign to gaslight me into submission. He called constantly, leaving voicemails that alternated between concern for my mental health and subtle threats about what would happen if I spread false accusations. Sarah called too, crying about how I was tearing the family apart, begging me to stop imagining things and just accept Michael's generous offer to reschedule my trip. The children sent text messages, clearly at their parents' direction, telling me they loved me but were worried about Grandma's confusion. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, and I recognized it because I'd been subjected to it for years. Anytime I'd questioned Michael's behavior, expressed hurt over being excluded, or asked for basic consideration, I'd been told I was being too sensitive, too demanding, too difficult. But this time was different. This time I had proof: the police report, the evidence bags, the detective's card with his direct number. I wasn't imagining things, and I wasn't confused. I was finally seeing clearly. 3 days after the airport incident, Michael showed up at my apartment unannounced. I heard his key in the lock, a key I'd given him years ago for emergencies, and felt my blood pressure spike with anger and violation. "Mom?" he called out as he walked in, his voice falsely cheerful. "I brought lunch. We need to talk." He stood in my doorway holding a bag from the Chinese restaurant I liked, smiling that same charming smile that had gotten him out of trouble his whole life. He was handsome still at 45, successful in his finance job in Manhattan, dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 6 months. "Get out," I said. The smile faltered. "Come on, Mom, don't be like this. I brought your favorite, General Tso's chicken." I said get out. He set the bag down on my counter, uninvited, and pulled out the containers as if I hadn't spoken. "Look, I know you're upset about the trip getting canceled. I know you were looking forward to it. But we can rebook with another suitcase full of drugs." He stopped unpacking the food, his hands freezing over the containers. For a moment, his mask slipped, and I saw something I'd never seen in my son's face before: cold calculation. "I don't know what game you think you're playing," he said quietly, "but you need to be very careful about the accusations you make." Is that a threat? It's advice. From someone who loves you. The word love coming from his mouth felt like acid. "You don't know what love is. If you loved me, you wouldn't have tried to destroy my life." I didn't try to destroy anything. I don't know how those drugs got in that suitcase, but I sure as hell didn't put them there. "Then explain the note." "What note? You keep talking about this mysterious note." I walked to my bedroom, retrieved the piece of paper from my jewelry box where I'd been keeping it safe, and brought it back to the kitchen. I placed it on the counter between us. "This note. In your handwriting. Hidden in a suitcase you gave me." He stared at it for a long time, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't read. Finally, he looked up at me with eyes I didn't recognize. "You can't prove I wrote that." It wasn't a denial. It was a challenge. "The police can. They have handwriting experts." "Do they? Because I'm pretty sure they released you without charges. I'm pretty sure they declared you a victim and closed the case. So unless you're planning to reopen an investigation that would implicate your own son..." He let the sentence hang there, confident that I would never follow through, that my love for him would override my need for justice. And the terrible thing was, he was probably right. Even knowing what he'd done, even seeing the cold stranger he'd become, some part of me still wanted to protect him. But a bigger part of me was tired of protecting people who had never protected me. "Get out of my apartment," I said again, "and give me back my key." "Mom, give me back my key or I'll call the police and tell them you're trespassing." He reached into his pocket, pulled out my spare key, and placed it on the counter next to the note. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Family is all you have left. Push us away, and you'll have nothing." "I already have nothing," I replied. "At least now I'm honest about it." After he left, I sat at my kitchen table and cried for the first time since Harold died. Not the quiet, dignified tears I'd shed at his funeral, but raw, ugly sobs that came from the deepest part of my soul. I cried for the son I'd lost, for the family I'd never really had, for the decades I'd wasted trying to buy love from people who were incapable of giving it. But eventually the tears stopped, and in the silence that followed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. The next few weeks were the hardest of my life, and also the most liberating. Michael's campaign to bring me back into line intensified. He recruited relatives I barely spoke to, old family friends, even my doctor, all of them calling to express concern about my mental state and urging me to reconcile with my son. The messages were always the same. Family is everything. Blood is thicker than water. He's your only child. You'll regret this when it's too late. But I didn't regret it. For the first time in decades, I was sleeping through the night. I wasn't waking up anxious about what favor would be asked of me that day, what disappointment I'd have to swallow, what abuse I'd have to accept with a smile. I started noticing things about my life that I'd been too busy people-pleasing to see before. Mrs. Chen next door, who I'd helped with her English for years, brought me homemade dumplings every Friday. The young man at the grocery store always saved the best produce for me when I came in on senior discount days. My mailman, Carlos, checked on me if he noticed my mail piling up. These weren't people who shared my blood or owed me anything. They were just human beings treating another human being with basic kindness and respect, the kind of treatment I'd been starving for without realizing it. I also started noticing how much money I had been giving to Michael over the years. Small amounts at first. Help with rent when he was starting out, car repairs when he was struggling, gifts for the grandchildren that grew larger and more expensive as they got older. Then bigger amounts. The down payment on his first house, tuition for Emma's private school, the loan for his home renovation that was never repaid. When I added it all up, sitting at my kitchen table with 20 years of bank statements spread out before me, the number was staggering. I had given my son nearly everything I had, money that should have gone to my own retirement, my own security, my own dreams. And what had I gotten in return? The privilege of being treated like an ATM with a pulse. But the money wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the silence, the way my feelings had been dismissed, my needs ignored, my very existence taken for granted. I had made myself so small, so undemanding, so grateful for any attention, that they had forgotten I was a person worthy of love and respect. Well, I was done being small. I called the bank and set up a new account that only I could access. I changed all my passwords, updated my will to leave my assets to charity instead of to Michael, and most importantly, I started saying no. No to the guilt trips, no to the manipulation, no to the constant requests for money, no to being treated like a convenience rather than a person. The first few times I said it, my voice shook. By the 10th time, it came naturally. By the 20th time, it felt like freedom. Michael's reaction to my newfound boundaries was swift and vicious. When I refused to give him money for yet another emergency, he exploded in a way I'd never seen before. "Who do you think you are?" he screamed over the phone. "After everything I've done for you, after how patient I've been with your crazy accusations, this is how you repay me? What exactly have you done for me, Michael?" I asked calmly. The question seemed to catch him off guard. I visit you. I call you. I included you in family things. You visit when you need money. You call when you want something. And you include me in family things by giving me a suitcase full of drugs? We've been over this. I don't know how— Stop lying. The words came out sharp and clear. I'm done with your lies. I'm done with all of it. Fine, he said, his voice turning cold. Don't come crying to me when you're sitting alone in that apartment with no one who cares about you. Don't call me when you're sick and need help. Don't expect me to be there for you when you're dying. He hung up, but his words echoed in my head for hours afterward. The threats disguised as predictions, designed to terrify me into submission. For a moment, they almost worked. The prospect of true solitude, of having no family at all, was genuinely frightening. But then I remembered the airport. I remembered the dog's teeth tearing through that suitcase. The horror of those packages being revealed. The sick realization that my own son had been willing to sacrifice my freedom, possibly my life, for money. A person who could do that to his own mother was not family. He was a stranger wearing a familiar face, trading on old love to enable new abuse. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my only remaining friend from high school, Nancy, who lived in Florida. We'd lost touch decades ago, but I found her number online and decided to take a chance. "Eleanor Patterson?" she said when I identified myself. "My God, it's been what, 15 years? How are you, honey?" Just hearing someone say my name with genuine warmth made me start crying again. I told her everything. About Harold's death, about Michael's betrayal, about the years of slow, steady diminishment I'd accepted as normal. "Oh, sweetheart," she said when I finished. "I'm so sorry. But you know what? Good for you for finally standing up for yourself. It takes courage to admit when people are treating you badly. Especially family." We talked for 2 hours. She told me about her own struggles with her children, her own journey toward setting boundaries and demanding respect. By the time we hung up, I felt less alone than I had in years. "You should come visit," she said, before we ended the call. "I've got a guest room and a pool, and we could catch up properly." The idea of traveling somewhere for my own pleasure, not because someone else had dictated it, was revolutionary. I booked a flight to Tampa the next day. Michael found out about my planned trip somehow, probably by monitoring my credit card, another violation I hadn't even considered, and showed up at my apartment in a panic. "Mom, you can't travel alone. What if something happens to you? What if you get confused or lost?" The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd been perfectly willing to send me to Europe alone with a suitcase full of drugs, but suddenly a trip to visit an old friend was too dangerous. "I'll be fine," I said, not inviting him in. "Look, if you want to travel, we can plan something together. A nice cruise, maybe. Somewhere safe. Somewhere you can keep an eye on me, you mean?" "That's not—" "Mom, I'm worried about you. This isn't like you. All this paranoia and anger." "You're right," I said. "The old me would have let you convince me I was crazy. The old me would have apologized for making you uncomfortable with my paranoia. But the new me knows exactly what I saw and exactly what you did." His face hardened. "What exactly do you think I did?" "You tried to use me to smuggle drugs into Europe. You were willing to let me go to prison to protect yourself. You've spent your entire adult life taking advantage of my love and giving nothing back." "That's not true. When was the last time you asked how I was feeling? Not as a conversation starter before asking for money, but because you actually cared about the answer?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "When was the last time you invited me somewhere without needing something from me first?" Again, silence. "When was the last time you said you loved me and meant it?" "I love you now," he said quietly. "No, you don't. You love what I can do for you. You love having someone who will always forgive you, always make excuses for you, always be there to clean up your messes. But you don't love me, Mom, and the truly sad thing is, I don't think you even know the difference anymore." I went to Florida for 10 days, and they were the most peaceful days I'd had in years. Nancy and I sat by her pool in the afternoons, talking about books and movies and memories from when we were young and the world felt full of possibilities. She didn't need anything from me except my company. She didn't ask for money or favors or emotional labor. She just enjoyed spending time with me because she liked who I was. It was a revelation. When I came back to Queens, refreshed and determined, I found 17 voicemails from Michael, each one more frantic than the last. They started concerned and escalated to angry, then desperate, then threatening again. "Mom, where are you? I went by your apartment and you weren't there. Seriously, you need to call me back. What if something happened to you? Mom, this is ridiculous. I don't know what point you're trying to make, but you've made it. Fine, be stubborn. But don't expect me to come running when you finally realize you need me." I deleted them all without listening to the later ones. I could imagine what they said. Instead, I spent my first evening back doing something I hadn't done in decades. I made plans for myself. I researched volunteer opportunities at the local library. I looked into senior fitness classes at the community center. I even considered adopting a cat from the shelter, something Harold had always been allergic to but I'd missed having around. For the first time in years, my future felt like something I was creating, rather than something being done to me. But Michael wasn't finished with me yet. When ignoring me didn't work, when guilt didn't work, when threats didn't work, he resorted to the nuclear option. He enlisted Emma. My granddaughter showed up at my apartment on a Saturday morning, tears streaming down her face. She was 22 now, beautiful in that effortless way young women have, but her eyes were red and her hands were shaking. "Grandma, please," she said as soon as I opened the door. "You have to forgive Dad. He's so upset. The whole family is falling apart." For a moment, seeing her distress, I almost caved. This was my granddaughter, the little girl I'd pushed on swings and read bedtime stories to, the young woman I'd helped pay for college even when it meant eating ramen noodles for weeks. But then I remembered why I hadn't seen her in months before this. I remembered all the birthdays and holidays I'd been excluded from. I remembered how she'd stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped treating me like I mattered. "Come in, sweetheart," I said gently. "Let's talk." She sat on my couch, the same couch where I'd spent so many lonely evenings waiting for phone calls that never came. "Dad says you're angry at him for trying to give you a nice trip. He says you think he put something in your suitcase, but that's crazy, right? Dad would never do anything to hurt you." I looked at this young woman I loved so much and realized she genuinely had no idea what kind of person her father was. To her, he was the successful dad who paid for her education and showed up to her important events. She'd never seen the side of him that viewed other people as resources to be exploited. "Emma," I said carefully, "when was the last time your father did something nice for someone without getting something in return?" She frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said. When has he ever spent his own money, his own time, his own energy on someone else without expecting something back? He gave you that trip. The trip that came with a suitcase full of drugs and a note telling me to keep quiet about something. Her face went pale. Grandma, that's not possible. I went to my bedroom and retrieved the note, the same one I'd shown Michael. Emma read it twice, her hands trembling more with each pass. This doesn't mean what you think it means, she said finally. But her voice was uncertain. What does it mean then? She stared at the paper, unable to come up with an explanation that made sense. Because there wasn't one. There was no innocent interpretation of those words. No benign reason for hiding such a message in my luggage. Maybe someone else put it there, she said weakly. Someone else who has access to your father's handwriting? Emma looked up at me with eyes full of confusion and dawning horror. Grandma, if this is true, if Dad really did this, then your father is not the man you think he is. She started crying again, but these were different tears. Not tears of manipulation or performance, but genuine grief for the illusion she was losing. He said if you don't forgive him, you'll die alone and sad, she whispered. Maybe I will, I said, but I'll die with my dignity intact. And honestly, sweetie, alone might be better than surrounded by people who see me as something to be used. She stayed for another hour, and we talked more honestly than we had since she was a child. I told her about the years of financial exploitation, the emotional manipulation, the way her father had trained everyone in the family to see me as a resource rather than a person. I never knew, she said over and over. I thought you were happy to help. I thought you wanted to be involved in everything. I did want to be involved, but I wanted to be included because you loved me, not because you needed something from me. When she left, she hugged me tighter than she had in years. I'm sorry, Grandma. I'm so sorry we made you feel that way. It's not your fault, sweetheart. You were just following the example you were given. What do I do now? She asked. How do I look at Dad the same way? You don't, I said. You learn to see people as they really are instead of as you want them to be. It's painful, but it's better than living a lie. After Emma left, I felt both heartbroken and hopeful. Heartbroken because I'd had to destroy a young woman's faith in her father. Hopeful because maybe, just maybe, the cycle of manipulation and exploitation would end with her generation. The final confrontation came a month later. Michael, Sarah, and their younger son Kevin showed up at my apartment for what Sarah called a family intervention. They sat in my living room like a tribunal, prepared to render judgment on my unacceptable behavior. Mom, Michael began, his voice artificially patient, we're here because we love you and we're worried about you. We think you might be having some mental health issues, Sarah added, her tone suggesting she was doing me a tremendous favor by expressing this concern. Kevin, who was 19 and usually absorbed in his phone, looked uncomfortable being there at all. I realized he'd probably been coerced into participating. Just another pawn in his father's game. What kind of mental health issues? I asked calmly. Paranoia, Michael said. Delusions. You've been making wild accusations. About the drugs in the suitcase? About alleged drugs. There were no drugs, Mom. You imagined them. I stared at him in amazement. He was so committed to his lies that he was trying to convince me that my own experience hadn't happened. I imagined the police dog. I imagined the TSA agents. I imagined being questioned for 6 hours. You had some kind of episode at the airport, Sarah said kindly. The stress of traveling alone, maybe some medication interactions. It's very common at your age. They had their story straight, their version of reality that painted me as a confused old woman whose mind was playing tricks on her. It was almost masterful in its completeness. And I suppose I imagined this too, I said, pulling out the note again. Michael glanced at it dismissively. Anyone could have written that. Or you could have written it yourself during one of your episodes. The audacity took my breath away. He wasn't just lying. He was trying to make me question my own sanity. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. You're all going to leave my apartment. You're going to stop calling me, stop visiting me, stop trying to manipulate me into accepting your version of reality. Mom, I'm not finished. The sharpness in my voice surprised all of them. Michael, you are no longer welcome in my life. You have proven that you see me as something to be used and discarded, and I refuse to accept that treatment any longer. You can't be serious, Sarah said. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. But we're your family, Kevin spoke up for the first time. We love you. I looked at this young man who barely knew me, who had been taught to see our relationship as transactional, and felt genuinely sad for him. Kevin, I love you too, but love isn't supposed to hurt. Love isn't supposed to make you feel small and used and worthless. What your father calls love is actually control, and I won't be controlled anymore. So that's it? Michael stood up, his face flushed with anger. You're just going to throw away 30 years of family? You threw it away when you put drugs in my suitcase. I'm just acknowledging what already happened. He started to say something else, but I held up my hand. Get out. All of you. And Michael, if you ever come back here uninvited, I'll call the police and show them that note. I'm sure they'd be very interested in reopening their investigation. The threat worked. They left without another word, but I could hear them arguing in the hallway as they waited for the elevator. After they were gone, I sat in my quiet apartment and waited to feel regret. I waited to feel lonely or scared or uncertain. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, proud of myself. I had stood up to my abusers. I had refused to accept their gaslighting. I had chosen my own dignity over their convenience. But the story wasn't over yet. A few weeks later, I discovered that Michael had been telling everyone who would listen that I was suffering from dementia, that I was making wild accusations and needed to be placed in a care facility for my own safety. The lies spread through our extended family like wildfire. Cousins I rarely spoke to called to express their concern. Former neighbors stopped to ask if I was doing okay. Even my doctor's office called to schedule a cognitive evaluation I hadn't requested. It was a systematic campaign to undermine my credibility, to make sure that if I ever did tell people what Michael had done, they would dismiss it as the ravings of a sick old woman. For a moment, the cruelty of it overwhelmed me. It was one thing to betray me privately, but to publicly destroy my reputation was breathtaking in its viciousness. But then I remembered something Nancy had said during my visit to Florida. The truth doesn't need defending. It just needs telling. So I started telling it. I called every person who had contacted me with concerns and told them exactly what had happened. I showed them the note, explained about the drugs, described the pattern of financial and emotional abuse that had led to that moment. Some believed me. Others clearly thought I was as confused as Michael had claimed. But I didn't care anymore about convincing people. I cared about telling the truth. The real vindication came from an unexpected source. Emma called me one evening in tears. "Grandma, I found something," she said. "I was helping Dad clean out his office, and I found papers, financial papers." "What kind of papers?" "Records of money transfers, large amounts, and some of them were from your account to his." My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "He's been taking money from your account, Grandma, for years. Small amounts each month, but they add up to, God, it's tens of thousands of dollars." The theft was almost anticlimactic after everything else. Of course he'd been stealing from me. Of course he'd found a way to access my finances without my knowledge. It was just one more violation in a long list of betrayals. "Are you going to confront him?" Emma asked. "No," I said. "I'm going to call the police." The fraud investigation took weeks. During that time, I learned things about my son that I wish I'd never had to know. The drugs in the suitcase weren't his first attempt at using family members as unwitting accomplices. He'd been involved in various schemes for years, always careful to implicate others while keeping himself at a distance. The stolen money was just the beginning. He'd used my credit in various fraudulent transactions, opened accounts in my name, even taken out loans against my apartment without my knowledge. When the detective explained the full scope of Michael's crimes against me, I felt sick, not because I was surprised, but because I realized how completely I'd been living in denial about who my son really was. "Mrs. Patterson," the detective said gently, "in all my years investigating financial fraud, I've rarely seen such systematic exploitation of a family member. Your son has been treating you like a personal bank for decades." Michael was arrested on a Tuesday morning while he was at work. Emma called to tell me, her voice hollow with shock. "Dad's in jail, Grandma. They arrested him at his office." "I know," I said. "You could drop the charges," she said hopefully. "You could say it was all a misunderstanding." "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Emma. It was theft. It was abuse. It was attempted drug trafficking using his own mother as a mule. But he's my dad, and I'm his mother. If our family relationships mattered to him, he wouldn't have done these things." She was quiet for a long time. Finally, "I don't know how to understand this. I don't know how to process the fact that my father is a criminal." "I don't either, sweetheart. But understanding isn't the same as accepting. You can acknowledge what he did without excusing it." Michael pled guilty to fraud and financial exploitation of an elderly person. The drug charges were harder to prove since I'd never actually left the country, but the financial crimes were ironclad. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution, though I knew I'd probably never see most of that money again. The day of his sentencing, I sat in the courtroom and looked at this stranger who had once been my little boy. He was pale and thinner, his expensive suit replaced with an orange jumpsuit. When the judge asked if he had anything to say to the court, he looked directly at me. "I'm sorry, Your Honor. I made mistakes, and I hurt the person who loved me most." Even then, even after everything, He couldn't just admit what he'd done without trying to manipulate someone's emotions. The reference to my love for him was calculated, designed to make me feel guilty for pursuing justice. It didn't work. After the hearing, Sarah approached me in the courthouse hallway. Her eyes were red from crying, her face drawn with stress. "I hope you're happy," she said bitterly. "You've destroyed your son's life." "No," I replied calmly. "He destroyed his own life. I just refused to let him destroy mine too. Those children have lost their father because of you. Those children lost their father the day he decided that money was more important than integrity. I just made it official." She started to say something else, but Emma appeared beside her mother. "Mom, stop," Emma said quietly. "Grandma's right. Dad did this to himself." Sarah looked between us, her face crumpling. "I don't know what to do now. How do I explain this to Kevin? How do I face the neighbors? How do I pay the bills?" For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. She was a victim too, in her way. Married to a man who had hidden his true nature from everyone who loved him. "You start by telling the truth," I said. "To yourself and to your children. Michael is responsible for Michael's choices. No one else." As I walked out of that courthouse, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. Not happiness, exactly, but a deep, quiet sense that justice had been done and I could finally stop fighting. The months that followed were the strangest of my life. For the first time in decades, I wasn't waiting for the phone to ring with another crisis or demand. I wasn't calculating how much money I could spare for the latest emergency. I wasn't walking on eggshells to avoid upsetting someone who treated me like an inconvenience. I was just free. I started volunteering at the library, helping elderly patrons learn to use computers. I joined a book club at the community center. I even adopted that cat I'd been thinking about, a gray tabby named Winston, who had been returned to the shelter twice for being too independent. "Sounds like my kind of cat," I told the volunteer when she warned me about his antisocial tendencies. Winston and I understood each other perfectly. We both valued our solitude and had learned to be wary of people who demanded too much. But we also both appreciated genuine companionship when it was offered freely. Emma visited regularly, usually bringing Kevin with her. My relationship with my grandchildren was still complicated. They were grieving the loss of the father they'd thought they knew, but it was honest now in a way it hadn't been before. "Do you miss him?" Kevin asked me one afternoon as we sat in my kitchen sharing tea and store-bought cookies. "I miss the person I thought he was," I said. "But that person wasn't real. So what I'm really mourning is an illusion." "That's really sad, Grandma." "Yes, it is. But it's also liberating. You can't have a real relationship with someone you're pretending to be someone else." Nancy visited from Florida for a week that spring, and we had the kind of relaxed, joyful time I thought I'd forgotten how to have. We took the subway into Manhattan and saw a Broadway show. We rode the ferry to Staten Island just for the view. We spent entire afternoons talking about books and movies and places we wanted to visit. "You look different," she said on her last day. "Younger, somehow. I feel younger. It's amazing how much energy you have when you're not constantly being drained by other people. Any regrets?" I thought about that for a long time. I regret that it took me so long to see the truth. I regret that I enabled his behavior for so many years by never holding accountable. But I don't regret standing up for myself when I finally understood what was happening. "What about the money? Do you regret pursuing the fraud charges?" "Not for a second. That money represented years of my life, years of working jobs I hated to support a son who saw me as a resource to be exploited. Getting justice for that wasn't about revenge. It was about acknowledging my own worth. On my 74th birthday, I did something unprecedented. I threw myself a party. Nothing elaborate, just Emma, Kevin, Nancy, who flew up from Florida, Mrs. Chen from next door, Carlos the mailman who had become a good friend, and a few people from my book club. We ate cake and played silly games and laughed until our sides hurt. As I looked around my small apartment filled with people who genuinely cared about me, I realized something profound. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Not obligation or guilt or manipulation disguised as love. Not constant anxiety about saying the wrong thing or disappointing someone. Just people choosing to spend time together because they enjoyed each other's company. Emma gave me a photo album she'd made, filled with pictures of us together over the years. Real pictures. Not the posed family portraits that had decorated my walls before. Pictures of us baking cookies when she was small, reading together on my couch, walking in the park during one of her rare visits. "I wanted you to remember the good times," she said as I flipped through the pages. "I never forgot them," I told her. "But I'm glad you didn't either." That night, after everyone had gone home and I was cleaning up the dishes, I caught sight of myself in the kitchen window. The woman looking back at me was still 74, still gray-haired, still alone in many ways. But she stood straighter now. Her eyes were clearer. Her smile, when it came, was genuine instead of painted on to please others. I thought about the suitcase that had started this whole journey, the black leather bag that was supposed to be my destruction, but had instead become my liberation. It was still in evidence somewhere, a symbol of my son's betrayal and my own awakening. In a strange way, I was almost grateful for it. Without that moment of shock in the airport, without the undeniable proof of what Michael was willing to do to me, I might have continued living in denial for the rest of my life. I might have died still believing that love meant accepting abuse, that family meant sacrificing your dignity for other people's convenience. 6 months later, I got a letter from Michael in prison. Emma had given him my address, though she'd asked permission first. The letter was 3 pages long, full of apologies and explanations, and promises to do better when he got out. I read it once, then put it in the shredder. Not because I was still angry, but because I no longer needed his validation or his excuses. His opinion of me, his version of events, his promises for the future, none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was the life I was building for myself, the relationships I was nurturing based on mutual respect rather than obligation. A year after his sentencing, I moved out of the Queen's apartment where I'd lived for 20 years. Not because I was running away from memories, but because I was ready to create new ones. I found a small place in Brooklyn, near the library where I volunteered, walking distance from the community center where I'd started teaching a creative writing class for seniors. The new apartment had big windows and room for a proper garden. Winston approved of the sunny windowsills and the neighbors who respected his need for independent space. On moving day, Emma and Kevin helped me pack. We found boxes I hadn't opened in years, filled with photos and letters and mementos from a life I'd almost forgotten I'd lived before I became so consumed with being useful to other people. "Look at this," Emma said, holding up a picture of me from my 30s, standing in front of a painting I'd completed in an art class Harold and I had taken together. "I didn't know you painted, Grandma. I'd forgotten myself," I admitted. "I stopped when your father was born. There never seemed to be time anymore. You should start again." "Maybe I will." And I did. I set up a small easel by the window in my new apartment and started painting again for the first time in 40 years. My hands were less steady than they used to be, and my technique was rusty. But the joy of creating something purely for the pleasure of creating it was intoxicating. I painted flowers from my garden, street scenes from my neighborhood, portraits of Winston in various states of feline dignity. I wasn't trying to impress anyone or prove anything. I was just rediscovering parts of myself that had been buried under decades of other people's expectations. One evening, as I was working on a painting of the sunset over the Brooklyn Bridge, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. But when I answered, I heard Michael's voice. "Mom? It's me." I was quiet for a long moment, paintbrush still in my hand. "How did you get this number?" Emma gave it to me. "Mom, I've been thinking about everything that happened and I want to make things right." "Things are right, Michael. For me. But we're family. We should be able to work through this. We tried that for 30 years. It didn't work out well for me. I'm different now. Prison changed me. I understand what I did wrong, and I want to make amends." I set down my paintbrush and looked out at the evening sky, painted in shades of orange and pink that would fade soon but were beautiful right now, in this moment. "Michael," I said quietly, "I forgive you." I heard him catch his breath. "Really?" "Yes. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It doesn't mean pretending that what you did was acceptable or that our relationship can go back to what it was before." "I don't understand." "I forgive you because carrying anger was poisoning my life. But I don't trust you, and I don't want you in my life. Those are separate things." "Mom, I hope you really have changed. I hope you've learned to treat people with respect and kindness. But I won't be testing that theory. I won't be giving you another chance to hurt me. You're my mother, and you're my son. But being related to someone doesn't give them the right to abuse you." I learned that lesson too late in life, but I learned it. I hung up the phone gently, not in anger, but in finality. Then I picked up my paintbrush and continued working on my sunset. That was 2 years ago. Michael has tried to contact me a few times since then, usually through Emma, but I've maintained my boundaries. I'm cordial when necessitated by family events, but I don't engage beyond basic politeness. It's not cruel, though some people see it that way. It's self-preservation. Emma and Kevin are both adults now, making their own choices about their relationship with their father. I don't interfere in that process. Don't try to influence their decisions. They know the truth about what happened, and they get to decide what that means for their own lives. Emma graduated from college and got a job at a nonprofit in Manhattan. She visits me regularly, and our relationship has depth now that it never had when it was mediated through her parents' expectations. Kevin joined the military right out of high school, says he needs structure and purpose after everything that happened with his father. Both of them still struggle with the cognitive dissonance of loving someone who did terrible things. I understand that struggle intimately. Do you ever miss having a normal family? Emma asked me recently as we sat in my garden, watching Winston stalk through the tomato plants. I never had a normal family, I said. I had a family where abuse was disguised as love and exploitation was disguised as need. Normal would be a vast improvement. But don't you get lonely? I considered the question seriously. There were certainly times when the quiet of my apartment felt profound, when I wished I had someone to share small, daily moments with. But there was a difference between loneliness and solitude. Sometimes, I said, but loneliness is just an empty feeling. What I had before was worse than empty. It was actively harmful. I'd rather be alone than constantly diminished. I admire you for standing up for yourself, she said. I'm not sure I would have been brave enough. It wasn't bravery, sweetheart. It was desperation. I was drowning, and I finally grabbed a life preserver. These days, my life is quiet in the best possible way. I wake up when my body tells me to, not because someone else needs something. I spend my money on things that bring me joy. Books, art supplies, good food, small trips to places I've always wanted to see. Last month, I took a painting class in Tuscany. Not the grand European tour Michael had planned for me as cover for his criminal scheme, but a small, intimate workshop with 8 other older women who had decided they deserved to pursue their passions regardless of their age. We painted landscapes in the morning and explored medieval villages in the afternoon. We shared meals and stories and laughed until wine came out our noses. For 2 weeks, I was just Eleanor, not someone's mother or grandmother or source of financial support. Just a woman with paint on her fingers and joy in her heart. On the plane home, I thought about how different this trip was from the one I'd almost taken 2.5 years ago. This time, I had packed my own suitcase with clothes I'd chosen, art supplies I'd bought with my own money, gifts for people who actually wanted to see me return. This time, when I walked through customs at JFK, I felt proud instead of terrified. Proud of my paintings, proud of my newfound confidence, proud of the life I'd built for myself after everything fell apart. The apartment I returned to felt like home in a way the old place never had. Winston greeted me with what passed for enthusiasm from a cat of his temperament. My garden had grown in my absence, tended by Mrs. Park from downstairs, who had become a dear friend. Emma and Kevin had left flowers on my kitchen table and a note welcoming me home. Simple gestures, but they represented something precious. People who were genuinely glad I existed, not because of what I could do for them, but because of who I was. That night, I sat in my garden with a cup of tea, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, and feeling more content than I had in decades. Winston curled up in my lap, purring his approval of having me back where I belonged. I thought about all the people over 60 who might be listening to this story, people who might recognize themselves in my experience, people who have spent decades being taken for granted, exploited by family members who mistake love for license to abuse. If you're one of those people, I want you to know something. It's never too late to demand better. It's never too late to set boundaries. It's never too late to choose your own dignity over other people's convenience. Yes, it's terrifying. Yes, you might lose relationships you thought were precious. But if those relationships were based on your willingness to accept mistreatment, they weren't really relationships at all. They were just elaborate forms of slavery disguised as love. The hardest part isn't standing up for yourself. It's admitting that you need to. It's acknowledging that people you love have been hurting you, using you, dismissing your worth as a human being. But once you cross that threshold, once you accept the truth about what's been happening to you, everything becomes possible. Even transformation. Even at 76 years old, rebirth. I wake up every morning now grateful to be alive, not just existing, but truly living. I have work that fulfills me, friendships based on mutual respect, hobbies that bring me joy, and most importantly, a relationship with myself that isn't based on what I can do for other people. That suitcase my son gave me was supposed to be my destruction. Instead, it became the key to my liberation. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that could have happened. Sometimes you have to lose everything to discover that you never had anything real to begin with. The morning light is starting to filter through my window now, painting everything in soft gold. Winston has claimed his favorite sunny spot, and my easel is set up with a half-finished painting of the Brooklyn Bridge at dawn. In a few hours, I'll head to the library for my volunteer shift, then stop by the community center to prepare for tonight's creative writing class. It's a simple life, but it's mine. Every choice I make is based on what brings me peace and joy, not on what other people expect or demand. Every relationship I maintain is one that adds value to my existence rather than draining it away. Is it perfect? No. Do I sometimes wish things had been different with Michael? Of course. But I've learned that wishing for different circumstances is less productive than making the best of the circumstances you have. And these circumstances, hard-won as they are pretty wonderful. So let me ask you this. Have you ever lived through something similar? Have you ever discovered that people you loved were using your love against you? If so, please share your story in the comments below. Remember to like this video and subscribe to help this message reach someone who needs to hear it. Because somewhere out there is another 73-year-old woman standing in her kitchen, staring at a suitcase and wondering if she's brave enough to ask the questions that might change her life forever. She is brave enough. And if you're that woman, or that man, or that person of any age who has been living as a resource rather than as a human being, you're brave enough too. Your life is not over just because you're starting to see the truth. Sometimes seeing the truth is where life really begins.